to start off our conversation, but the reality is that those national and international headlines, the bigger stories and dominant narratives that we've heard both about our founding and about our lives today can sometimes obscure other very important and very hopeful stories about how we have come together from the very beginning and how we have done the work of caring for each other and building thriving communities throughout our history. So, our conversation today is going to take a bit more of that tack. We are going to be digging into some history. As a history and American studies major, I'm very excited for this conversation to take place. But we're going to be looking to our past to think about our present and our future, and to consider the deeply held traditions of community philanthropy that run throughout both our culture as a nation, as one nation, as e pluribus unum, but also as a variety of communities that exist side by side within our country. So I'm going to start off, if I can do that. Great, awesome. The slide advanced. I'm going to start off with some Zoom norms. I think these will be fairly familiar to everyone who's joining us today at this point. We want to remind everyone that the webinar will be recorded. As soon as we have a chance to get that up online, we will share the link with all registrants, as well as share it publicly via the Johnson Center's email newsletter and LinkedIn. We invite you to follow us in those places to make sure you get the recording, as well as all the other resources and conversations we're going to be talking about today, and that generally flow through the Johnson Center. If you have technical issues or want to participate in the conversation with other attendees, please use the chat feature. Our incredibly capable colleague, Emily, is on the line today to help manage and navigate any of that. So do please let her know if you have any challenges. If you'd like to just have conversation, that is a great place to do it as well in the chat. But if you have a specific question that you would like our panel to address, either during the kind of opening presentation conversations or later on during the panel discussion or Q&A at the end, please do drop that specifically in the Q&A feature. You can find that it's usually at the bottom of your screen, the little Q&A box. Sometimes it's under the More feature. But please put your questions there so that we can easily keep track of them and make sure that we get as many of those addressed as possible. I will go ahead and start by introducing myself before I introduce our lovely panelists today. My name is Tory Martin. I am the Director of Communications and Strategic Partnerships at the Johnson Center for Philanthropy. It is my role to not only help tell the story of our center, but to really help find the many ways in which the work that exists across the center integrates with one another. We are an applied research center, which means we do work that is focused on using evidence, data, insights gleaned from information and interviews, and other methods uh, of gathering data and information to really affect practice. One way we do that is by looking to stories that come from previous eras in philanthropy, previous examples, and that is work that we are doing today. So, like I said, very delighted to have you all here today. And with my History and American Studies hat on, I cannot but begin this webinar with a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville is one of the most recognizable names in the history of American civil society, and in kind of commentary on who we are as a people. He was a young French nobleman who was sent to our country in the early 1830s with a compatriot, actually to study the American penal system, of all things. But what he really did was he undertook a deep examination of the people of America and the democracy that we practiced here. We were, as of 1776, the first colony to break away from its mother in the history of the world. What did that mean to try to create a multicultural democracy in a new place, in a new land, out of new peoples coming together? He went back to France after about 9 months of talking to Americans, and he wrote about 750 pages on who we are. And I want to share this quote with you. A single Englishman will often carry through some great undertaking, whereas Americans form associations for no matter how small a matter. Clearly, the former regard association as a powerful means of action, but the latter seem to think of it as the only one. Thus, the most democratic country in the world now is that in which men have, in our time, carried to the highest perfection the art of pursuing in common the object of common desires, and have applied this new technique to the greatest number of purposes. Is that just an accident, or is there really some necessary connection between associations and equality? I share this because the conversation we're going to have today really just dives into the connection between association, what we consider to be civic life, and the practice of a democracy. In this case, Tocqueville was really talking about equality as equality before the law, equality to be heard, to think, to collaborate with one's peers and neighbors in a democracy. What do those two practices have to do with each other? Have to do with each other remaining healthy? And how can we turn back to those practices even more deeply today? So, with that kind of framing, I would love to introduce our panelists. We are going to kick off today with Dr. Dennis Dickerson, who we are so delighted to have. Dr. Dickerson is the Reverend James M. Lawson Chair in History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. His landmark book, The African Methodist Episcopal Church, A History, begins with Bishop Richard Allen's founding of the AME Church in Philadelphia at about the same time that our republic was taking shape. It follows the Black church as an enduring space for civil society, for mutual aid and support, and the struggle for freedom throughout American history. His decades of scholarship on African American religious history make him the ideal guide to this conversation and to the Allen tradition and its place in the larger story of American associational life. We will then turn to Dr. Michael Layton, my dear colleague, who is himself a native Philadelphian. It is impossible to know Michael without knowing that fact. But Michael is the W.K. Kellogg Community Philanthropy Chair here at the Johnson Center. This was the first endowed chair in the United States specifically devoted to the study of community philanthropy. He began his own career working with neighbors in the city where he was born and raised, and now his research on collective giving, community foundations, and philanthropic ecosystems across the Americas brings both scholarly depth and practitioner experience to this founding era story and its living legacy. We then also have Dr. Kathleen McCarthy. She is the founding director of the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society at the CUNY Graduate Center and professor of history. We are so delighted to have all three of you. Dr. McCarthy's landmark work, American Creed, Philanthropy and the Rise of Civil Society, 1700 to 1865, is the foundational historical account of how a voluntary association and democratic self-governments, those two themes we'll be working with today, developed together in America. Her decades of scholarship on women and on global civil society make her the ideal guide to Rebecca Gratz's contributions to this conversation and to the larger story of associational democracy. We're going to do just a little bit more history to set the stage here. We want to talk a little bit about the fact that all three of these historical figures are from Philadelphia. Philadelphia looms quite large in our national myth. It was, at the time of independence, the largest city in the 13 colonies, with about 30,000 residents. That makes it also one of the largest cities in what was then the British Empire. But it's critical to note that about 8% of that population was enslaved. In Philadelphia at that time, we were still dealing with some of the very complex and dark questions that have haunted our history and haunted our democracy and associational life for centuries at this point. But it was also a place of tremendous innovation. The ever ornery John Adams, who was himself a Bostonian and very proudly so, observed this about Boston versus Philadelphia. He, of course, spent a great deal of time in Philadelphia as a member of the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention, and he was certainly a man of bold and forceful words in a lot of ways. But he wrote, Philadelphia, with all its trade and wealth and regularity, is not Boston. The morals of our people are much better. Their manners are more polite and agreeable. They are purer English. Our language is better. Our persons are handsomer. Our spirit is greater. Our laws are wiser. Our religion is superior. Our education is better. We exceed them in everything. but in a market and in charitable public foundations. Never one to mince words, John Adams. But for Adams, that final exception was really quite significant. Boston may have surpassed Philadelphia in revolutionary spirit and apparently in, desirability to be on the cover of Vogue. But Philadelphia had become America's leading center for public charitable foundations. What does that mean? This was a place where people were coming together to build voluntary associations, exactly the forms of life and collaboration that Tocqueville talked about, and ultimately created enduring civic institutions. Philadelphia became America's first great laboratory of civil society, a place where these voluntary associations, where religious freedom, commerce, and democratic participation combined to produce institutions that would influence our nation for generations and indeed continue to do so today. So today we are going to explore the lives of three Philadelphians who really helped to build this culture. They grew out of it, they built it themselves, and they helped create these lasting traditions. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and I will begin by turning it over to Dr. Dickerson well, actually, I'm going to introduce our three characters really fast first. Sorry. We are going to talk to Dr. Dickerson first because we are going to start with Bishop Richard Allen. I will let him spend some more time in biographical world, but Reverend Richard Allen showed the community building could also be an act of liberation. He was the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first independent Black denomination in the United States, and he created an institution in which Black Americans could practice self-determination, cultivate leadership, and provide mutual aid and confront systems of racial exclusion. His work reminds us that philanthropy is not only about generosity, but about action. It's about agency. It's about dignity and the power of communities to build institutions for themselves. We will then turn to Dr. Kathy McCarthy to talk about Rebecca Gratz. Rebecca Gratz created a legacy of belonging. She devoted more than 60 years to building institutions that strengthened both the broader community and Jewish communal life. She helped establish the Philadelphia Orphan Asylum, founded the Female Hebrew Benevolence Society, the first non-synagogal Jewish community life association in the United States, and later created the nation's first Hebrew Sunday school. She believed deeply in working across faiths to address shared community needs. But when overzealous Christian missionaries sought to convert Jewish children, she staunchly responded by creating institutions to strengthen Jewish identity, while remaining fully engaged in civic life as a woman where few other opportunities and avenues of agency were open to her. Her legacy demonstrates that philanthropy can build bridges across communities and create stronger bonds within them. And lastly, the indomitable Benjamin Franklin, about whom you will hear from Dr. Michael Layton. Franklin, what to say about Franklin? Franklin is often remembered as an inventor and a statesman, but his work emphasizes not only these lasting historical legacies for which he is best known, but also his work as an institution builder who helped establish a distinctly American model of civic problem solving through voluntary associations. What made Franklin's approach innovative was that his constant reminder that everyday American citizens had the agency and the ability to take action for the communities that they cared about and to build civil society rather than to simply benefit from charitable action from on high, from the elites of society. Let's see, waiting for that. All three of these really combine into a conversation that we've been having at the Johnson Center for the last 3 months, and that I invite you alongside this conversation to engage with. For 3 months, we've been sharing information from our Field Focus Redefining Community Philanthropy series, which looks at how the words community, the word philanthropy, the concept of community philanthropy beyond familiar institutions like community foundations really have come to life across generations in the United States, and then begins to call on voices from around the world to speak to how community philanthropy is practiced in cultural contexts and within specific times in our lives as global citizens. So we also hope that you join us by looking into that series, of which this webinar is an important part. Now we are going to turn to Dr. Dickerson. Thank you for your patience. We are so delighted to have you here, and I'd love to hear from you more about Reverend Richard Allen.
Thank you, Tory, and thank you to the Johnson Center for Philanthropy for this invitation, and to the kind audience that has tuned in. Richard Allen was born enslaved in 1760 in Philadelphia, and was sold with his family members into Delaware while still under 10 years old. He purchased his freedom in 1783 after working in a variety of locations in Delaware. Among his tasks was to drive a salt wagon to Valley Forge to help supply George Washington's soldiers there. So this linkage between him and the foundations of the nation is very graphically seen. Uh, Allen was converted to Methodism in 1777 while still enslaved, and managed to get Methodist preachers to come to his slave owner's home, Stokely Sturgis, and he too was converted to Methodism as well. And that's what stimulated Sturgis to allow Allen to work for his freedom, which he purchased, as I mentioned, in 1783 with $2,000 in Continental money. It's fascinating to reflect on de Tocqueville and his observations about America's associational culture, because it's deeply embedded in the ethos of American society. Allen pointed out in his autobiography that was posthumously published in 1833 that while still enslaved in Delaware, he and other enslaved people were so appreciative to Methodist preachers, circuit riders who came through his Delaware, Stokely Sturgis's Delaware farm to preach the gospel to them, that they shared with Methodist preachers what little they had, either in terms of money that they could gather together from doing jobs off of in addition to their slave duties, but also giving them produce from their own truck gardens. So this spirit of philanthropy, this spirit of sharing and giving, was not an ethos that was restricted in any way within the moneyed or property classes. And one sees this unfolding in Allen's life, really in almost every stage of Allen's life. After he won his freedom in 1783, he traveled throughout the Middle Atlantic, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, in some cases in slaveholding Maryland, preaching as a Methodist itinerant. He returned to Philadelphia in 1786 and found that the African American population, in his words, were religiously and otherwise neglected. And he and others came together to form the Free African Society, a mutual aid association that collected money periodically to make sure that widows and orphans were taken care of, and so that persons within their numbers could have a dignified burial. This Free African Society drew from the same ethos, the same philanthropic ethos that I mentioned with respect to his enslaved counterparts in Delaware, where they shared with Methodist circuit riders their small amount of produce, so that these preachers who knew great privation, these preachers from Great Britain, would have some sustenance. The Free African Society really became the nucleus out of which Allen's church, Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, emerged and was built in 1794. And Allen, who himself had been manumitted, and his first wife, Flora, also manumitted by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, gave property that they had accumulated to build the church. Another example of sharing, another example of philanthropy. And this church that they established, and other churches that became a part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church that was incorporated in 1816, became a physical refuge, and it facilitated the freedom of fugitive slaves who were escaping enslavement in the middle states, Maryland, Delaware, and the deep South states who came through Philadelphia. This was a physical aegis for them, facilitating freedom, aligning with the abolitionist movement, aligning with other movements that were designed to end enslavement in American society. This kind of expansive philanthropic impulse was embedded in the very founding of their church and of their denomination. Allen, during this period, was present in Philadelphia in 1793 during the yellow fever epidemic, which estimates vary, but the settled number on which historians agree was about 5,000 persons in Philadelphia, perhaps more, died as a result of the yellow fever epidemic. And Allen and his friend Absalom Jones volunteered. During that time, those who had the wherewithal to escape Philadelphia and other cities where the epidemic hit did so. They left the city, and those who were too poor, who had no resources, had to remain in the city. And there, the scourge of that disease hit them and caused widespread sickness and fatality. Allen volunteered to help bring relief to yellow fever victims, volunteered, presented his name and those of his associates to the mayor of Philadelphia. And he brought medical treatment, such as it was. He had been instructed in bleeding by the famous Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who was a great supporter and benefactor of Allen. And also Allen hired nurses, black women, who nursed victims of the yellow fever epidemic. Allen himself caught yellow fever and recovered and resumed his duties as a relief worker during the epidemic. He and others buried the dead. And he and Absalom Jones wrote a pamphlet about the yellow fever, about their activities during the yellow fever epidemic, because they had been accused of pilfering and dishonesty, and they wanted to defend their reputation and their integrity. And one of the things that, if one can note in the pamphlet, aside from giving a full financial account of their expenditures, defending themselves against the charge of thievery, he kept careful records about the epidemic and left for posterity a demolition of some myths concerning yellow fever and the African American population. There was a myth around that black people couldn't get yellow fever because they had originated in tropical climes. Allen, in his careful chronicle, showed that wasn't true, that as many blacks as whites were afflicted with yellow fever. And he took made other kinds of objective, empirical observations that help to increase medical knowledge about the nature of the disease and the conditions that incubated the spread of yellow fever. These were just some of the examples of how Allen, with regularity, was engaged in philanthropy. They didn't call it, as you know, it wasn't called philanthropy then, but this is what he was doing. I just want to take a note go back to what I mentioned about the Free African Society. It was a mutual aid society where African Americans it was founded in 1787, the early part of 1787, they came together to take care of widows and orphans and burial of persons who were members of the society. This was this was parallel to the Methodist class system. As you know, Methodism was spreading rapidly in the Middle Atlantic. The first Methodist conference was held in Baltimore in 1784. Allen attended it. And one of the organizational hallmarks of Methodism was the class system, in which persons were organized into religious cells that were designed, in the language of John Wesley, to bear one another's burdens. And this kind of behavior, this kind of ethos, this kind of attitude, this kind of religious tenet coincided, paralleled, and mutually influenced, mutually reinforced, at least for Allen and his compatriots, this notion of mutual aid, that persons were to bear one another's burdens. And this kind of ethos was not racially or ethnically restricted. This meant it signified that it had an expansiveness, even though it may have begun within a particular enclave. I'll just say this in closing. Allen lived from 1760 to 1831. He lived a long time, given the life expectancy of persons in the late 18th and early 19th century. And his church, Bethel Church, became a center for philanthropy. Obviously, he did not use that terminology. As I mentioned, it was a place, an underground railroad station, where fugitive slaves would come to get shelter, to get sustenance, as they moved on afterwards into other parts of the North and on to Canada. It was also the first gathering place where the first Negro Convention was held in 1830, over which Allen presided, to lead discussions and to make plans to aid and to fight for the rights of African Americans elsewhere in the United States. So Allen was an exemplar of philanthropy. Promoting and concretizing and operationalizing this ethos of sharing, and in the Methodist parlance, in the Methodist terminology, of bearing one another's burdens.
I would love to ask you a follow-up question to that, just I'm going to ask you a very large question and then I'm going to suggest you answer it in about 2 minutes.
Okay.
Which is to say, many of the themes that you're picking up on here and sharing about Reverend Allen's life, they have to do with institutional strength. They have to do with transparency. You said the word planning, conventions, building physical spaces. So I'm curious if you can reflect a little bit from your scholarship on the AMA Church, which of course then traces how the church and other institutions have supported the long struggle for civil rights. What do you see as the most enduring features of Allen's institutional vision, kind of his understanding of building actual lasting institutions and operations, like his operational brilliance? how that kind of flowed through to the history of shaping Black civic life today.
I'm going to give a simplistic answer to a very complicated and poignant question. And you gave me the clue at the beginning of your own presentation in your citation of de Tocqueville, and that is uh, vulnerable populations, enslaved populations, other categories of vulnerability. Institutions empowered them in ways that they could not be empowered individually. An individual slave would have less influence, less impact. Coming together with other enslaved peoples, with other vulnerable peoples, that 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 potential was mobilized through institutional and associational forms. And that's what enabled them to do philanthropy. Whether it was sharing produce from their truck gardens with Methodist preachers, or responding to Allen's call to help yellow fever victims, or building the physical structures of a church, a building, which actually still stands on the site where Allen built it.
Isn't that incredible? Well, thank you so much, Dr. Dickerson. We'll be bringing you back into the conversation a little bit. Dr. McCarthy, I'd love to turn the microphone over to you to hear about the development of women's philanthropy.
Terrific. Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I am delighted to be here and to have a chance to talk about how Rebecca Gratz's career reflected the broader history of women's philanthropy. And I want to give a special shout out to the organizers of this very interesting panel today. As I mentioned, I'm talking about Rebecca Gratz, who was one of Philadelphia's most notable philanthropic pioneers. And her career reflects the history of women's philanthropy in a whole variety of ways, even though in some ways Gratz was an anomaly. Her family was rich. Most of the people who got involved in creating women's organizations were more middle class. She never married in a period when most women married, and she was Jewish at a time when there were only very small Jewish communities in a few cities in the United States. Moreover, she played a leading role in both secular and Jewish women's organizations, something that very few other women did. But in the beginning, some of the first orphanages and charities for women were secular rather than being strongly Protestant, which came in the 1810s. But in other ways, her long philanthropic career, and as Tory mentioned, she had a very long life, extraordinarily long. She was born in 1781 and died in 1869, and her career spanned almost 70 years, her philanthropic career. But in many ways, it reflected more general patterns in women's early philanthropy. First, it was rooted in voluntarism, and you can see the same thing in the Black church that Dr. Dickerson just spoke about so eloquently. America was a cash-scarce economy in the first half of the 19th century, which made women's voluntarism incredibly important. In fact, until mega millionaires like Andrew Carnegie came along at century's end, Americans defined philanthropy as both giving and voluntarism, and voluntarism was much more common. And one of the questions that you presented, I'll just leap ahead a little bit. You wanted to know about continuities. Volunteer time is still incredibly important, even though we tend to think of the Giving Pledge as philanthropy. In 2023, the value of volunteer time was pegged at $1.6 billion, as opposed to about $6 billion, which was donated in cash. So once again, it's still incredibly important, and women still tend to volunteer a little bit more than men. Gratz not only helped to create one of the country's first charities for women and children in 1801, and this was done with a lot of Protestant women and probably some Quakers as well. She also helped to create Philadelphia's first orphan asylum, and the city's and the country's first Jewish women's organization to help Jewish women in 1819. And she created the first Hebrew Sunday school in 1838. And she served as an officer in each one of these organizations for decades. Second, women's charities were rooted in transatlantic transfers. I've spent my career studying global philanthropy as well as American history, and I even spent several years bouncing around France to look in the archives to see what kind of philanthropy was going on in Tocqueville's France during his lifetime. As far as I can tell, until the development of the modern grant-making foundation at the beginning of the 20th century, everything else was borrowed, whether it was charities or orphanages. The model came from Germany. Bible and Sunday school societies from England, religious orders from France, social settlements from England. Everything until then was a borrowed model, but we still made it distinctively our own. But Gratz's organizations were no exception. One of the first women's organizations in the US was started as by a Scottish immigrant who had been active in one of these things in Scotland before she came to the United States. There were also Quaker networks that were very important in creating women's organizations in Philadelphia. Third, religion, especially evangelical Protestantism, played an absolutely central role in the United States in building philanthropy, and particularly women's philanthropy. And it played a key role in Gratz's philanthropy as well, even though she was Jewish. And Tory mentioned a little bit of this. The Hebrew Sunday school that she created was directly modeled on the American Sunday School Union's Sunday schools, which were very important for spreading literacy in the United States. And the Hebrew Sunday school did the same. She even used some pages from the ASSU books to create her little textbooks for the first Hebrew Sunday school. And the reason she wasn't that religious when she was growing up as a young woman, but then the Society for the Amelioration of the Jews, of the Condition of the Jews, started getting really pushy in Philadelphia, and they'd stand outside the temple and hand out tracts, and then they'd try to follow up with people. And this is what made her finally begin to try to learn Hebrew, and led to the creation of the other Jewish organizations that she created. Fourth, even though the models were imported and steeped in evangelicalism, different groups adapted them in different ways, creating the pluralism and diversity of American philanthropy that remains one of its earmarks today. And you heard Dr. Dickerson talk about some of the ways that African Americans developed their own unique culture of philanthropy, particularly around the rights of freedmen and former slaves, and abolitionism, and as well as a lot of other things like movements to not buy anything produced by slaves. So Gratz's associations are a stellar example of that kind of pluralism and adaptation. Fifth, it helped a variety of people, but it gave the women who founded and funded these organizations something incredibly important as well. It gave them the rights they lost when they married in the United States. And this was a period when most women married, because under the English common law doctrine of fin covert, all of their property, everything they owned, right down to their clothes, became their husband's property the day that they said, "I do." And this was used as an argument for not allowing them to vote, because they didn't have property and therefore they couldn't be independent. But if their organization was chartered, and most of these early charities were, the trustees could collectively buy and sell property suddenly. They could own it, they could invest in it, they could sign legally binding contracts. This made them financial actors as well, both as employers and as investors in everything from canal stock, which helped to spark the transportation revolution, to small loans, little loans in their communities. Normally, the only way you could get a loan in this early period was to go to some rich, usually white guy. So it diversified the pots of money that could be used for community development. And this is also an important role of the Black church as well, as Dr. Dickerson undoubtedly knows very well. And it gave them political roles, bringing them into partnerships with state and local governments, often through municipal grants, because the whole idea behind granting a charter, the Commonwealth ideal, was that this organization was providing a service that the government could not provide on its own. So it was written into the contract from the beginning that they were important providers of public goods, not by themselves often, but in tandem with government, right? Public-private partnerships. So it not only gave them political roles, but it gave them a voice in the allocation of public resources and in the shaping of public policy, because through their organizations, they got women's and children's issues on public policy making agendas for the first time. They would say that women and children shouldn't be in the almshouses where they could be cheek by jowl with people with mental problems, all sorts of things. And therefore, they needed charities that would help them earn money and stay in their own homes. And if you got public money for that, it's on the public policy making agenda. So Gratz was in the forefront of all of these kinds of activities. And once again, because of this, she, like Richard Allen, she was one of the country's first really influential philanthropic entrepreneurs. And I'm sure you could say the same thing about Ben Franklin as well. So I think I will stop here and I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful, thank you. And before I ask my own question, that is a good reminder to everyone joining us for this program that if you have questions for our panelists, please drop them in the Q&A box at any time. And we'll be moving to Q&A shortly here. But before we do, Dr. McCarthy, I heard you say a lot about networks and the exchange of information.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious how you think about sort of the role of how information flowed then, the role of how connections and networks flow now. Was there a specifically, how did women in these networks sort of influence the work that they were doing together? Were they able to collaborate? Do you see that sort of transplanted into today's civil society as well? Just that power of the network throughout this and how much they were able to speak to one another. And I don't know, maybe there is no good answer to that because they were,
AI, but evangelical Protestantism was extremely important for several reasons. One, when you get into social reform, the mission was to go out and eradicate sin, so temperance movements, abolitionists, and so on. But literacy was at the heart of revealed religion. You had to be able to read the Bible for yourself. And so the spread of literacy, much of it done by Sunday schools, right, before public educational systems, because that's what they taught, how to read, so they could read the Bible, enabled people to correspond and create institutions not only across space, but also across through the mails, and the mail system was developing in this period. So the way that information traveled was threefold: one through publications, one through mail, letters, correspondence networks, and one through physical movement. And the third one is why immigrants are important, and travel. But it had, in each instance, it had this physical form, right? And the biggest difference is we no longer have to wait for snail mail, right? Or somebody to move into your community, or wait to get a letter or now an email, which is instantaneous instead of weeks and months, to get new ideas, to get information, to create new kinds of communities, and to do very different kinds of fundraising than the really tedious kind of face-to-face solicitation that people like Gratz would have had to do. So I think those are the big differences. But, this was a period when it depended on physical movement, right?
Really interesting. Thank you. And now we're going to move over to Dr. Layton to hear about Benjamin Franklin.
Thank you, Tory, and a big thank you to both Dr. Dickerson and Dr. McCarthy for the generosity of sharing your expertise and wisdom with us. So Benjamin Franklin was unique among the most prominent founders in that he rose from a modest artisan family with little formal education. As a teenager, he was an indentured servant to his older brother, who was a printer, and whose harsh treatment, as those of us the younger brothers might know firsthand from the hands of older brothers, led him to flee Boston as a fugitive, escaping his indenture, and arrive in the fine city of Philadelphia in 1723. Franklin built his success through business acumen, through civic leadership, and a truly extraordinary ability to forge social connections, not through inherited wealth or status. Today, we're all probably more familiar with Alexander Hamilton's rise as an immigrant orphan from humble beginnings, thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda. But Franklin remains an important cultural icon. His face on the $100 bill gave rise to the hip hop anthem, "It's All About the Benjamins." He made a guest appearance on the sitcom The Office, and he even served as an unlikely foil for Triumph the Insult Comic Dog, for those of you that are fans of Conan O'Brien. And we know his face, right? It's a familiar face with his bald head and spectacles. But we don't know as much about how he built associations and that part of his life. So while I have the luxury of drawing on a familiar figure to many, I have the opportunity to talk more in depth about his associational activities. So I want to begin near the end of Franklin's life. He was a member of the Constitutional Convention that sat in as almost a sort of a grandfatherly figure. And the moment that I want to share with you is that there's an anecdote that as he was leaving the Constitutional Convention after its work was done, there was a woman in the crowd who asked him, well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy? And Franklin is said to have replied, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And I think that really epitomizes the wisdom of Franklin and the experience underlying his political activities, was that knowledge that it was common citizens that had to keep a republic. The woman who asked that question was Elizabeth Willing Powell. She was a brilliant, politically engaged intellectual and the wife of Philadelphia's mayor. Her Society Hill home, which I happened to have the good fortune of visiting a couple of years ago, functioned as a sort of European-style salon where many politically active figures gathered and debated politics away from the public eye. And she's probably most well known for writing a letter to George Washington that is said to have persuaded him for accepting to serve a second term as president. But her question to Franklin reminds us that in Philadelphia, even a political order that excluded women from formal power could not exclude them from political life and influence. And I think drawing upon the wonderful stories that my colleagues have already shared, I think it's an important lesson about the formality of politics, the narrowing of entry ramps to politics, and how women, freed enslaved people found ways through associations of finding that public influence, of exercising that kind of public voice. Civic engagement has always been shaped by context and power, by those who hold a seat at the table, and for those who bring their own seats or create another extension to the table to find their way to power. And that tension runs through Franklin's story as well. So consider his evolution. Franklin escaped his brother's control as a young man and rose through the ranks as a printer, which was a lucrative trade if you knew how to write and you knew how to make connections, which Franklin had a talent for both. But early in his career, he profited from and participated in practices tied to slavery. He was, in fact, an owner of slaves. His newspaper ran advertisements for the sale of enslaved people and notices seeking the return of those who escaped as fugitive slaves, as they were called. But later in life, his perspective changed. He visited a school for the education of Black children, and Franklin was moved to publicly support abolition as a result of seeing firsthand that children, whether they were Black, white, or some shade in between, were humans and deserving of their freedom. He ultimately served as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. His last public act was signing a petition to Congress calling for an end to slavery. So Franklin reminds us that the ledger of the founding era contains real stains, original sins, if you will, but also that moral change was possible, even late in life, even for the most celebrated man in America at the time. So what did Franklin actually build in Philadelphia through his associational talents? The author and historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote a classic essay on America as a nation of joiners. And he offered an inventory in that essay, which is familiar to many fans of Franklin. He formed an organization called the Junto. I'll point out that its original name was the Leather Apron Club. And leather aprons were worn by artisans like printers and others. But when a young man who was an attorney and not sort of the middling sort came on board, they dropped the leather apron, and Franklin literally and figuratively dropped his leather apron as he rose through the ranks of wealth. He also founded a subscription library that eventually became the Library Company. He created the American Philosophical Society, our oldest learned body. And in the interest of transparency and a humble brag, I was a beneficiary of fellowships from both the Library Company and the American Philosophical Society when I was writing my doctoral dissertation, and used it as an excuse to flee North Carolina and go home to Philadelphia for a summer. And many other things. An academy for the education of youth that eventually became the University of Pennsylvania, a volunteer fire company, a fire insurance company. And what's important about these institutions is that none of them required great wealth to join. They were open to widely available to people. You might need some resources to pay a membership fee, but it was not sort of an exclusive club. What was required was the time and talent of neighbors and to exercise the ties and bonds that connect us one to another. Franklin took the principle of voluntary group action and demonstrated what it could accomplish. What he was weaving in the language we use at the Johnson Center was a social fabric, the civic infrastructure of trust and reciprocity on which communities depend. And as my friend and colleague Tory pointed out, John Adams himself had to admit, even begrudgingly, that Philadelphia stood out and exceeded Boston in its charitable public foundations, in large part for the contributions of the three individuals highlighted on this panel. So let me conclude by shamelessly drawing on the work of Kathleen McCarthy, her book, American Creed, which I recommend to anybody concerned about 18th and 19th century American history of philanthropy and civil society. She pointed out that Franklin forged a highly visible model for combining philanthropic, public, and market activities for communal ends. While contemporaries like Jefferson and Madison supplied the egalitarian rhetoric and philosophical flourishes, Franklin's career shows us how the scaffolding of American civil society was built. Associations that generated social capital among men, largely men in Franklin's case, of middling means, public-private partnerships, and a broadened mandate for social advocacy. Franklin's enduring contribution lay not only in his ideas, but in his practical mastery of building and sustaining associations that translated sociability into lasting civic infrastructure. So that's the legacy I want to highlight. Community philanthropy is, for which my chair is named, is not a particular institutional form. It is a practice that is grounded in relationship and shaped by context. And Franklin understood this 2.5 centuries before we gave it a name. He answered Mrs. Powell with a challenge, a republic if you can keep it. His life suggests how we keep it through the patient, cooperative work of neighbors building institutions together. So that's.
Thank you, Michael. I know it's challenging for you to keep your love for Franklin in a certain, in webinar presentation length. So we appreciate your ability to do that. I do have a follow-up question for you as well, and you alluded to the direction that I'm going to head in here when you mentioned that Franklin was, of course, predominantly working with men who were in large capacity like him. They were white, they were middle or upper class. They were in many cases property owners or business professionals. Franklin enjoyed, and these men he worked collaborated with, among others, of course, he had an expansive network, but enjoyed privileges that Allen and Gratz did not. How should we think about both the opportunities those privileges afforded him and his ability to push them to communal ends, but also to think about the limitations they imposed on his vision and others' vision for an inclusive society at the founding and ongoing. I mean, he created institutions that were necessarily limited, and that have hopefully expanded over time. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how we should think about that.
Yeah, I hinted at this when I talked about how the name of that original club was changed from the Leather Apron Club to the Junto. And it's illustrated in what he wore. Originally, he had a leather apron, dressed rather simply. As he succeeded, he changed his dress and aspired to become a gentleman. And the difference between the middling sort and the sort of gentleman class was in this kind of reduced hierarchy in America, that it was a more extensive and complex hierarchy in England and other countries in Europe. But in America, and I stand to be corrected by my colleagues here, that division among free white men was middling sort of working class, we would call it now, and men of leisure. And Franklin in his lifetime emerged from one to the other thanks to his wealth. So by wealth, by using connections, which were much easier to come by as a privileged white male, one could climb that ladder with relative ease in the United States compared with England and Europe. What that configuration leaves out, and it's a common configuration of historians who talk about Franklin, is the people that were at the margins, African Americans, Native Americans, women, right? Those who were on the sides of that kind of social structure and had to find their way in. So it was, I think I would give Franklin some credit for evolving into the perspective that there was a necessity for greater equality, as your quotation of Tocqueville points to, and that associations were an important means of creating those opportunities to advance the cause of equality, at least under the law, if not in terms of wealth.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I do have a couple of kind of overarching questions for you all to lead into, but I do want to address one slightly more defined and specific question, which is for Dr. McCarthy that we received in the Q&A box, asking if you could possibly talk a little bit more about how efforts to convert Jewish young people to Christianity helped motivate Rebecca Gratz's deeper involvement in philanthropy and other activities.
Well, I think she felt that she was being hounded, and things that had not appeared on her screen quite so sharply. The difference between Protestants and Jews, I think, was sharpened considerably by these organizations that were so aggressively trying to convert people. And also, there were some marriages, even in her own family, between Jews and non-Jews. And, you know, each kept their own religion. But these groups, some of them were trying to promote marriage with Jews to convert them as well. So it was pretty much a full frontal attack. And that heightened her consciousness about being a member of a particular group. But it also led to new kinds of organizations. And, you know, the part of the charm and part of the terror of civil society and the nonprofit sector is that you do have opposing points of view that often clash. You know, it goes back to Federalist 10. What do you do with factions? Their idea was they would cancel each other out. And so, you know, one of the beauties, but also one of the complications of civil society is that we do have this freedom and this diversity and this plurality of ideas that sometimes clash and lead to new kinds of initiatives and organizations.
Yes, I see, Michael, you kind of nodding your head. I'm wondering if you want to respond to that in any way
No,
or
it's
add
just
to it or.
I was nodding out of recognition because I was really struck by that part of Kathy's book, um, American Creed, available to bookstore near you. I hope, maybe not because it's 20 years old. But
It was on.
yeah. Uh, but the other thing I noticed, the question came from Eileen Heisman, who happens to teach at the University of Pennsylvania and has lived and worked in Philadelphia for quite some time. So a shout out for my fellow Philadelphian.
Excellent. Well, then I'm going to pose this question to the three of you, which is to think about, we really wanted to use these conversations as a launching pad and platform to think about community philanthropy in America today, its role, its enduring traditions, to what extent we feel it has been not necessarily silenced, perhaps, but quieted in a lot of ways. And I think that there's some interesting questions we could ask about these three particular leaders who not only created institutions that have endured, but traditions that have endured, and to some extent, kind of with a small c, celebrity personalities that have
Mm.
endured and that continue to be part of our conversations and continue to be um, beacons or pillars that we point to as examples of how to be involved in civic life. So I'm curious to hear from any of you who want to jump in, or I'll call on someone if I have to. But what aspects of these historical figures' visions do you really still see at play in civil society today? What lessons can community philanthropists today amplify even further that kind of worked for Gratz, Franklin, and Allen? What were the clarion calls to action um, that helped them shape society, and how do you still see that shaping civil society?
Mm.
Let me tackle this, because
Yeah.
you see this in religious communities. It's not exclusive to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which I have studied, but I think this is a common feature of most, if not all, religious communities. Um, and that is, uh, they have deconstructed the the normative meaning of philanthropy. That is the way in which we use the term philanthropy as being associated with property and money classes. That there are community involvements uh, underline the fact that philanthropy transcends class and condition. What churches particularly illustrate, though not exclusively, is that there are concentric circles of giving and sharing. That most people can't give $1 million to an important cause, but you can as in the case of the enslaved people that I illustrated earlier, you can share with persons the produce from your truck garden. Uh, you in studying the AME Church, the in the early years of the 19th century, it had a system of of supporting the institution called dollar money, and every person was responsible for giving $1 for the larger enterprise. And your name was listed in the annual minutes of the conference. Um, Perhaps you couldn't lead an endeavor and lead a particular operation, but you can contribute your dollar to it, and that would be listed. And that demonstrated that your giving mattered, and one received recognition of the level of giving that one was able to give. And I really, and I want to repeat myself because I just think it's so important. These kinds of associations are empowering. It's when community members, however lofty their position or however humble their positions, uh, uh, participating in a cause, participating in community construction, it's empowering. It's liberatory, and it creates the an impulse and an ethos that your dollar does matter. And your dollar together with the dollars of other persons similarly situated can have an impact. And I would just throw out to my colleagues, my academic colleagues in history, that there's a plethora of case studies that can be done that illustrate just these points that I've just raised.
I think in terms of community giving, if you cut it into both volunteerism and monetary donations, I'm thinking back to Robert Putnam's work and how he was saying that in Bowling Alone that we've all become so atomized that everybody's apathetic and not participating, and then you get the change in the political sphere, and boy, was that wrong. But in terms of volunteerism, once again, I think if you look at the religious organizations, you will find a whole universe of giving and communal activities, whether it's bridging or bonding. I'm sure it's more bridging bonding social capital and bridging for their own communities. But even statistically for giving, the largest category has historically been giving to religious institutions. And these are small scale donations. This is passing the basket or the hat or whatever at religious services. In terms of dollar giving, there's been a tremendous upsurge in foundations. Almost all of them are small and community oriented, and they systematize the donor's gift at the local level. The Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, those are anomalies. But this kind of community giving would be donations you would find in these small foundations that continue to multiply exponentially, and in community foundations. So, there are a lot of different kinds of institutions that are keeping this community focus alive and healthy, that often have very little to do with the kind of mega philanthropy most Americans think of when they think of philanthropy, Bill Gates, Melinda Gates, and so on.
Well, I would just bring it back to hip hop and correct some artists from the past and say it's not all about the Benjamins, right? It's not all about money. I think that's a consistent message here, that it's about all five of the T's that we allude to at the Johnson Center and across the sector pretty widely now. So the treasure counts, but there's also the time and the talent, the testimony of speaking up for a cause, the ties that get mobilized to move people to action. And in the junto, they didn't have money. They had each other. And they met regularly. They built that social capital and with an intention to understand and to support each other. How do we make our community better? How do we advance ourselves individually? And that connection between market, community, and government was really very vibrant and very clear to them. Um, and it's something I celebrate. I think about my neighborhood in Philadelphia, and there's a group of people that have, for decades, just volunteered their time to keep a local park beautiful. Palmer Park, right in front of St. Mary Hospital, where I was born, now gobbled up by Temple University. Not that I have anything against universities. Um, but those people, they, once in a while they might get a donation of rakes and stuff like that, but they buy flowers and they plant them. They figure out how to jerry-rig a fire hydrant so they can water the plants. And there's just something so vibrant and genuine and important about that low cost, high social capital initiative.
I appreciate that, Michael. And I think it also brings us back to a little bit of where we started in the notion of grounding our conversation in Philadelphia. Not only because it is your favorite place on earth, but because it is a place. It has a
Mm.
strong sense of place. Its placeness has a large role in our national myth. And to think about combine those ideas with what you were talking about, Dr. McCarthy, in terms of the physical conveyance of information and of network connections. Combine that with what you were talking about, Dr. Dickerson, around physical spaces where people can share and be present, and physical spaces that operate in a variety of ways and are maximized in their use. This comes back to a certain amount of the necessity of place-based philanthropy. We'll do Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton said in one of the Federalist Papers, distance has a physical effect on men's minds. We are a very large country with many, many different cities, towns, villages, communities where this work goes on. And a lot of it has to be done in person, she says, completing a virtual webinar. So I want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. We are at time. A reminder, this program was recorded and will be shared with everyone. Dr. Dickerson, Dr. McCarthy, Dr. Layton, we cannot thank you enough for sharing your expertise, for answering some questions I may have surprised you with, and for really bringing some brilliance to this longer term, multi-century American experiment. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful
Thank
rest of your
you.
Take care.